Greetings, everyone. Uh, as many of you know, we have Trade and Commerce Vertical at NITI Aayog. We have been conducting a lot of programs, webinars, workshops, seminars, and so on to develop capacity in trade policy research and analytics. So, in this series, in this context, today we are very fortunate to have Dr. Isha Jaswal. She is the head of research cell and associate professor at DME University. She's here in Delhi. She has kindly agreed to come here and do this seminar for us. So we have some of our colleagues in NITI Aayog here, both here physically present and joined virtually, and we also have some other friends and colleagues from outside. So the purpose of this particular seminar is to give you an introduction, a very basic introduction to what is called as computable general equilibrium modeling. In short, it's called CGE modeling, and in particular, we are going to give a very user-friendly open source global CGE model called GTAP, Global Trade Analysis Project. So this model has been very widely used across the world, in almost all the countries in the world, pretty much, for a variety of research and analysis, particularly contributing to policy. It was mainly started for international trade policies, but over the years, it has been developed for energy, environment, climate change, labor, public health, and several other issues, a wide range of issues. The beauty of all these models, CGE models, is that they capture all the sectors in the economy, and they also, in this particular model, we also capture all the countries in the world. So that gives us a flexibility to work on any topic on any country. At least there is data, there is some basic modeling framework, which is already quite nuanced and complicated, because if you want to model the real world policies, real world issues, the model that is used for that also should be complicated, because the real world is complex. So, in order to capture that, you have to have a complicated model. But at the same time, the nice thing about GTAP is that it's also very user friendly. So, all the details of the models, the equations are all in the back end, and on the front end, you have the a very user-friendly interface. So today, Dr. Jaswal will give us an introduction to this modeling, and also she will do a demo on an example on a CGE model exercise for trade policy. So over to you, Isha.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. Is this fine?
Yeah. Visible.
Yeah. All right. And I would also like to thank Dr. Badri, Vishnu, and Mr. Kanan for making this happen, for giving me inputs before finalizing this presentation as well. So I won't take much time and I'll just start off. So I am going to make a hypothetical uh, assumption, or I'm going to take a hypothetical scenario rather, and I'm going to set the rationale for CGE modeling first. So okay. Fine. So as you can see, I have taken a hypothetical scenario where, let's say, USA and Vietnam, they get into a free trade agreement with regards to textile and clothing sector. Now, when US and Vietnam are getting into a free trade agreement, just trying to analyze what's going to happen in Vietnam, obviously it is going to impact its exports. It is going to impact its industrial production, will have impact on its employment. These are certain assumptions that we can make, that these are the variables that are going to get impacted. Other than that, this will directly impact these economic variables in the textile and clothing sector. But not only this, within Vietnam, the related industries will also get affected. Maybe the agricultural production, which are the source of raw materials towards textile and clothing. Even the manufacturing sector, which sources raw materials to textile and clothing sector. Similarly, employment and the prices in the entire economy will experience some kind of changes. However, when I move to the next slide, Okay. Yeah. Now, the policy change has taken place with regards to FTA happening between USA and Vietnam. But can this have an impact on India? Yes, because USA is one of the biggest trading partner of India. India exports a lot of TNC products to US. So if Vietnam is now getting into a free trade agreement with USA, it might have implications for India's TNC sector, related industries in India, and hence the economic variables. Then if I consider the FTA, that is NAFTA, where USA had gotten into a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, including this TNC sector. So now how will this FTA between USA and Vietnam impact the Canadian and Mexican economies and its industries if this FTA is to happen? So my point here is that one policy change or one policy initiative between USA and Vietnam will not only impact their economies, their exports, their imports, but it is going to have impact on other economies as well. And this is where CGE comes into the picture. So, what is CGE modeling? I'm going to break up each and every word. So, first, I'm going to talk about computable. So, like we said, that when FTA takes place, it is going to probably impact the GDP. It is probably going to impact the employment variable. It is probably going to impact the industrial production in whatever nations are under study. But by how much? What degree? Is it a greater degree or is it a smaller degree? So, when we talk about CGE modeling, the computable word basically indicates that this model has the capacity to quantify the effects of the shock that we are giving, or the experiment that we are running, or the what if scenarios that we are trying to test. Next is general. So basically, general means that this particular model encompasses all the economic activities related to producers, consumers, all the stakeholders in the economy. Okay. Yeah.
In all sectors.
And all sectors. Yeah, actually it didn't change there. And then equilibrium, in general, equilibrium is the state of rest or the state of balance. But when we talk about CGE, this equilibrium occurs at a set of prices, like we can see, where all producers, consumers, or basically the agents, if we are studying the national economy, if we are studying the global economy, it depends upon what kind of model we are studying. So all the agents in the economy, all the prices in the economy are at balance. And it satisfies the macroeconomic market clearing constraints. That is very important. So, in a nutshell, when we say CGE, it is a system of mathematical equations. It is a system of mathematical equations that describe an economy as a whole and the interlinkages between these agents as well.
So just to elaborate on the prices part, what we intend to say is that when, for example, let's say that the tendency is that the supply is greater than demand, then the prices will have to decrease because you have excess supply. And then when the prices decrease, then your demand will increase, and then your supply and demand will go to the equilibrium. So that is what we are talking about when we say that equilibrium occurs at a set of prices. So that new set of prices would dictate the equilibrium. So if the prices do not change so much, then the equilibrium will not exist. That's the idea. And the example can be the other way around also. If you have lower demand or higher demand, then the prices can has to increase to reduce supply so that you.
All right, so just indicating towards the components of the CGE model. Yeah, so with regards to agents, we have producers and consumers, factor endowments, land, labor, capital, other raw materials, commodities, both goods and services, and obviously market for commodities. So buyers and sellers, interactions domestically and internationally, again, depending upon what the CGE model is and what the modeler is trying to do with that. Next, we're going to look into the elements of CGE modeling. Now, when we say elements, so sets, endogenous variables, exogenous parameters, these are some important and basic elements to a CGE modeling. So if we look at the sets, they are basically the domains within which the parameters, variables, and equations are defined. So, for example, if there is a set I, as we can see, and this set I is basically indicating towards industry, and QO is output, right? So for a nation's database, if the database consists of only three sectors, assumingly agriculture, manufacturing, and services, then QI, which is output, for the set I, which is industry, so QI will indicate a vector where QI will be replaced by agriculture, industries, and services. So it will be output of agricultural sector, output of service sector, output of manufacturing sector within that vector. Similarly, it is PS, which is supply price of the producers in the three sectors. When we say QE, it is quantity of exports in the three sectors. And when we say QEIRS, this basically means quantity of exports are exporting country, S importing country. So this is how we read the sets. Endogenous variables and exogenous variables. So endogenous variables are the variables through which the equilibrium is determined. So the shock or the experiment is applied on exogenous variables. Exogenous variables are fixed, they do not change pre and post the experiment. So when an experiment is run, when a shock is applied on an exogenous variable, then the simulations take place where the endogenous variables will be determined as a solution to the equation of the models. So for example, if let's say labor supply is an exogenous variable, wages is an endogenous variable. So wages will adjust until the demand for labor and supply of labor is equalized. Similarly, there are exogenous parameters. So exogenous variables and exogenous parameters, this can also be changed by you and me, who are not the modelers, but given the nature of our study, we can change the exogenous parameters also. But obviously, a lot of logic, a lot of review of literature and the correctness of whatever we are changing and why we are changing, that has to be analyzed before changing these parameters and variables. Then equations. Broadly, there are two types of equations. One is behavioral equation and other is identity equation. When we talk about behavioral equations, these are basically derived from macroeconomic theory, where we say, let's say, so how the economic agents are going to behave given a policy shock. So if we say consumers are going to maximize their utility given the budget constraint. Similarly, we talk about producers are going to either minimize their cost or maximize their output given the constraints and the technological feasibilities. So there are two types of equations. Identity equations basically act as constraints. So identity equations basically ensure the balance. So I'm going to basically do a explain the diagrammatic representation and the identity equations thereon. So I'll take that later. Now, with regards to CGE modeling applications, like Dr. Badri had also said, it has been used, it has been put into practice from a very long time. So from the 80s itself, it has been put into use. Initially in 80s, developed countries were using it for analyzing the tax policies. Developing countries were using it for development policies. Later on in 90s, a lot of work has been done around free trade agreements and trade liberalization. And of recent, a lot of work is being done around climate change, energy, and topics like that. So this is a very brief introduction to CGE modeling. Now I'm coming to the GTAP model, that is Global Trade Analysis Project.
Just to give
Dr.
a
Badri,
little
yeah.
more perspective on the history. It all started with the Leontief, the Professor Leontief, who first developed the input-output system, input-output tables. That was the first development, and then simultaneously, around the same time in the 1930s, 40s, uh, Professor Kenneth Arrow, Debrew, they developed general equilibrium theory. So general equilibrium theory was a very mathematical theory, and they had proof for the fact that equilibrium exists and what are the conditions under which the equilibrium exists and so on. So then in the 60s is when the first CGE model was developed. I think it was in Norway or Denmark. So that was the first attempt to basically take these mathematical equations which were purely done in a real analysis kind of setting, to marry that with data. And the data is basically the input output table, because the general equilibrium theory, or the Edgeworth box that many of us would have studied in economists among us would have studied in microeconomics. So that those kind of things are the hardcore theory of general equilibrium. And then the question arose as to how do we use it in real life, real policy situations. Then the input output framework became like a very relevant framework, because we are, like Dr. Isha mentioned, we are thinking about the whole economy, the entire, all the markets, all the agents. So that can only be captured in an input output table. So we have this input output table, which is like a transactions matrix. So we have a matrix in which you have commodities and you have industries. And you, in order to produce, let's say, textile fabric, you have to use cotton, you have to use plastic, you have to use chemicals and so on. So you have the proportions of all these things in value terms, in dollars or rupees. That is basically the input output table. So you have chemical can be an input to textiles, but chemical can be an output with other inputs. So you have this kind of thing, and that is how it was done. And then in the 70s and 80s, this was further developed. The CGE model got further developed, and a lot of even for India, even this building, the planning commission, when the planning commission was there, a lot of CGE modeling exercises were done for different plans in order to understand the impact of different ways of allocating resources to different sectors and different states and so on. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I was curious because it started from Norway, and you have basically at some point in time your IO tables must be populating with EU data, and I know that there's some background development in US as well. But now, as ma'am was showing, there's so many countries involved, so all the variables and all the IO data has been captured for this kind of simulation, or
Yeah.
is it like for some developing countries there's a default value that is added?
No. She will explain in a minute. So now we are still in the theory part. Now she will show. Now she's coming to. So far we are talking about CGE in general.
Okay.
Now she's going to come to GTAP, and then she will show the data also. And
Okay.
data exists for all the countries.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So one thing that I would like to highlight, the beauty about GTAB database is that it's a fully documented, publicly available, model. So if you want to read, there are n number of technical papers that are available. So there is a lot of transparency. So I was talking to Dr. Badri earlier, and he told me that how these models had, been worked around, but there was no access to these models. And then Professor Thomas Ertl, when he went to Australia, he saw this model. He came back to US, collaborated with Professor Allen, and that is from where it began. And everything was fully made publicly available. So yes, it is a complicated model. I have been doing this from 2016, and still I keep going back to the texts. But what I assure is that today, at least with the demo, we will be able to know how to handle it, and at least do certain simulations that aren't. That bit I can assure you today. Uh, so yeah, since its inception in 1993, GTAB has been it has been used time and again. I could just put in a few examples here. So for example, in 1995, the WTO's Uruguay Round Agreement. So out of five, three of the quantitative papers were based on GTAB modeling. Then the WTO and World Bank's co-sponsored conferences, Millennium Round of Multilateral Trade Talks in Geneva, there also practically all the quantitative studies were emanating from the CGE modeling setup or framework, sorry. Then again, like I told you, now it is being more so used in climate uh, policy analysis as well. So even IPCC, they are using GTAP in a big way. So it is being used. And I will come to the model components of the GTAP model. So when I talk about the model components, first three model components that I'm going to talk about, one is the regional household, then is the government consumption and private consumption. Now, regional household is more of an assumed sector. Assumed sector as in it is there within the models, it is there within the SAM matrices. But why has this been constructed? So regional household is assumed to receive all the incomes that accrue within the domestic boundaries of an economy. Now, when I say government consumption, private consumption, and one more thing, that is savings, these are the three final demand components where all this income is disseminated from regional households. So, government, private, and savings get their income from the regional household. Why has this been done is because this particular framework assures the identity that expenditures will not go beyond the incomes. The slide hasn't changed. अटल जी कह रहा है. अच्छा.
Yeah.
I know. I'm through. Okay. All right. So I'll straight away explain this diagram. So we can see there's regional household. So I'll first explain the top part of it. So like I said, regional household will receive all incomes generating within the domestic boundary of an economy, and these incomes will further be disseminated to private household savings and government sector. This assures that the expenditures does not go beyond the incomes. So that's the first identity. Then the second step, we introduce the firm sector or the producer sector. Now, when I say producer sector, so producer sector is obviously engaged in the production activity, and during the course of production activity, they are obviously paying out factor incomes. So when I say VOA, which is value of output at agent price, for the payments made to the endowments, this simply means the factor incomes that they are paying out to land labor capital entrepreneur. Again, these are the incomes that are generated, they are going up to the regional household. They're not going to the private household sector or to the house, any other sector in the economy. They're going up to the regional households. So that is one thing. Now, where are they receiving their incomes from? The producer sector. So private household is obviously making purchases from the producer sector. So VDPA basically is the domestic purchases from the private sector. VDGA is domestic purchases from the government sector. So all these expenditures are going to the producer sector. Then below we see VDFA. These are basically producers purchasing from each other for intermediate consumption. So there are four things happening that I discussed right now: is producers paying out, private sector making purchases from the producers, government making purchases from the producers, and producers making purchases from the producers. So these are the sources of incomes, and this entire thing is exhausted in VOA. That is another identity. Apart from that, now we introduce taxes, because obviously producers, private households, and savings, they also pay taxes. All these taxes again go up to the regional households. Savings, so regional households, savings come from regional households, but then they go in form of investments to the producer sector. So this is a setup for a closed economy model. This is basically showing the accounting relationships in a GTAP region in a closed economy setup. Now, when I put it in a multi-region open economy setup, I'm obviously introducing rest of the world. Uh, how it has been explained in the technical paper, I'll put it in the same way, is that when it says multi-region open economy model, what it is trying to show here is, so when this particular technical paper was formulated, at that time GTAP had 66 regions. So it is said that all 66 regions could not be put up in the diagram, and then it showing interlinkages would have been different. So what they have said is that all the regions have been clubbed into one, and one region has been pulled out, which is rest of the world. That is why they are naming it as multi-region open economy model. So effectively, these are not two regions. Effectively, these are 66 regions that they are representing. But just for simplicity's sake and clarity's sake, this is how they have put it. So most part of it we have discussed. Now, when rest of the world comes into picture, trying to put it in a very simple manner, obviously producers are going to engage in imports and exports. So there are import payments and there are export receipts that are taking place between the firm sector and the rest of the world. Private households are obviously making purchases or imports from the rest of the world. Similarly, governments are also making. So the expenditures are going out from private households and the government sector, right? And apart from that, the rest of the world is also making payments in form of import taxes and export taxes. So those kind of payments are coming out, which are again going to the regional household. So this is how the framework works. This has been integrated in the model, and like it was asked, for every region, the data is available. It is accumulated. So basically, when we talk about GTAP based construction, Dr. Badri, if you would want to talk
Yeah, so
about this,
basically,
yeah.
this sort of answers your question.
Yeah.
Um, we can keep it. That's fine. So every country releases its own input-output table. So we also have in India, we have released input-output tables generally. Last few years, we have been releasing supply and use tables, which from which you can derive an input-output table. So for every country, there is an input-output table, which is then shared with the Center for Global Trade Analysis, which is in Purdue University and in US, and they basically take the IO table and then they take these IO tables from different countries, and all of them have different sectoral classifications. So there is a need to harmonize them, and they are all in different currencies. So you need to use US dollars as a common currency, and for that you typically you take the input output table, and then you have this international data sets. You have IMF macroeconomic data, World Bank macroeconomic data, United Nations trade data, and all these different international data sets. And then there is a procedure which is like a matrix balancing kind of procedure, mathematically speaking, that would take all these input output tables. You can go to the previous slide, and then fit them with these international data sets. And then once that is done, then there are parameters which are basically the behavioral parameters, the elasticities and so on. So they are all combined together. So what we call as once you combine the input output tables with the international data sets, we call them as fitted input output tables. They are fit now, fit with the international data sets. Then they are all assembled together because you have macroeconomic data, production, consumption, input output data, all these things together. Then you have trade data, which is bilateral. So the diagram that Dr. Isha showed a few minutes ago, in that we show one region and then rest of the world. But in reality, in actual data, it's like instead of that, it will be like India, US. Then you'll also have India, China. You may have India, Russia, and so on. So you'll have all different pairs of countries will be represented there.
So this data is embedded within the one the executable file in this case, or is it an add-on? Like all of this have to pick it up.
Yeah, it's all in an off-the-shelf format.
Okay.
So it's all there in one place. So that's what she will show in the demo.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. So these are all just explanations before going into the. So you can go.
Yeah. So just a little bit on the social accounting matrix, which can also be looked through the aggregator that we will look in the demo. So this is basically how the database is, put in for ready use, ready visibility, and ready understanding. So it's a square matrix data. Every agent has both column and rows. Columns will signify expenditures. So if I'm talking about, let's say, again, the private household sector. So the column of the private household sector will represent its expenditures, and the rows will represent its income. And they both should be equal. So this is just a snippet of the social accounting matrix. So for example, here we can see private household. So this private household, if I look at the row column, this will represent the private household income, right? And if I see private household from here, from the column side, right? So what are the expenditures that it is making? It is like we saw it in the diagram. It is making expenditures for demanding imports. It is making expenditures on its demand for domestically produced commodities and services, and plus the tax that it is paying. So which sums down to the column as private consumption expenditure. So this is a SAM matrix, and for every agent, there is a column which represents expenditure. For every agent, there is a row which represents income. And this is there within the database of GTAP for every country. This is just the history of the GTAP database version. So it started in 1993, like I told you, with 15 regions and 37 sectors. Currently, GTAP 10, which was released in 2019, has 141 regions and 65 sectors. And it has 4 reference years, that is 2004, 7, 11, and 14. And just to end this, where all can we use this? It, like Sir said, it is being widely used. So international trade policies, definitely it is being used in a big way. Then public policies, energy, environment, demographic patterns, it is being used now, and impacts of technology or technological changes. So these are some broad areas where it can be used. And it's a global model. So I'll end my presentation here. We can move on to the demo. Right? Okay. So this is the GTAP aggregator database. So like we said, there are 141 regions. But I will come back to my example where I started off with Vietnam, India, NAFTA countries, Canada, Mexico, USA. So when I open this aggregator, this is the default aggregation that you're going to see, right? So these are the regions, Oceania. Within Oceania, you have Australia, New Zealand, and rest of Oceania. You can see this mapping here. So this is the AUS, NZL, XOC. These are the codes, and they are mapped with Oceania region, and these are their names. But I don't need them. What do I do? I need India, I need Vietnam, I need USA. That is the need for my study. So I can make changes here. Like I have inserted a column here. Yeah. So for instance, I say Vietnam. And when I say Vietnam, I'm going to map it here. Is it moving on the screen? It's moving here, it's not moving.
Everything moves well. You keep it.
Okay. So I have mapped it with Vietnam.
Yeah.
Let me map. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is how I map it. Similarly, I can add USA, I can add n number of other regions. Basically, I can disaggregate regions and I can aggregate regions also. So what I have done is I've already created an aggregation where I have put USA, India, Vietnam, Canada, Mexico, and I have aggregated all other regions into one, that is rest of the world. So this is how I have modeled it for the current use.
So the idea here is ideally we want to use all the 141 regions for our study. Ideally, we want to use all the 65 sectors. But many times we are focused on specific countries, specific sectors, and we are not so much interested in others. So in this model, there is no way of ignoring anything. The whole world has to be included. All the countries, all the sectors have to be included. But the flexibility is the aggregation. So you can say, for example, you're not interested in Oceania, you're not interested in Australia as a country, then you club it with a bunch of other countries and call it another country. Like even if you're not interested in Oceania, you can club Oceania, you can club the regions 2 to 5, you can just put them together into one region, rest of the world. So you have all kinds of things that you can do. So one way is how Isha did here. There are also many other ways of handling this. You can also copy that into Excel and modify it. So there are many other ways to do this, but this is a facility that readily exists. If you're a programmer, you're good in data analytics, you can always do it in R or Python or something. The same thing, simple aggregation of data. So that's the first step.
Yeah. The second step is where you can also, choose your sectors. So for instance, when I say sectoral aggregation, so here all the sectors are mentioned, and again you can aggregate them into 1, 2, 3, 4, or you can disaggregate them into all 57. It's up to you. I haven't played around much with the sectors here. I've just in the model, I've just
Keep the default.
yeah, kept the default.
That's a nice thing because you have this is the default is something that the colleagues in the center, GTAP center have worked out. It has some pattern,
Yeah.
like it has some kind of schematic pattern here. But if you don't like this, you can always change it. You can always come up with your own aggregation.
So since textile and clothing is already the fifth component here, as you can see, so I have not touched anything else since we have our sector here. I have not aggregated anything, but you can. You can probably just do agriculture, manufacturing, services, and textile and clothing. That is also possible. It is completely up to you. And then you will have factor aggregation also: land, unskilled labor, skilled labor, capital, and natural resources. I have just clubbed unskilled and skilled labor into labor. That is what I did. And then you can save the aggregation, and it will create an aggregated file for you, which you can, the zip folder, you will import it in run gtab, and then you will start running your experiments. So I'll go to that now.
So the very first step is to aggregate the data.
Mhm.
And now the second step will be to set up the model. We can come to the questions later.
All right. I have already imported the zip folder, but I will tell you how to do it. So we open the file tab. There is version archive here and the option to load zip. So when you're going to load, click on the load zip option. You can simply select your zip folder and it will be imported in here. In case you are working on some particular database and you want to change it. So for example, I've already imported my database. So whatever is already imported will be here. So you can see it through the versions tab. It's not, I'll go slow.
Yeah. So again, a little bit of history here will be interesting because when the trade negotiations are happening, the countries had their own CGE models, input-output tables, and they would come up with their trade negotiation stances based on their own models. Many times it will be contradictory. One country, US will say something and EU will say something else. So then the question was, how do we come up with a unified framework? And all of them will they'll say that we have the same model, same theory, same data, but then things are different. And that was because they didn't have an open source framework. So GTAP was developed for that to fill that gap, so that everyone could say instead of saying that my model has this and that, they can actually, like you see here, that this version that Dr. Isha is showing. So here one can, once you do, for example, if within the team, if, let's say NITI Aayog, somebody like let's say trade vertical is doing some study on something related to energy, and then we can do the model, we can save the version archive in a zip file, and then we can send it to the energy vertical. Energy vertical can load it and then see if there is something wrong, is something that you disagree, and then you can sit together and analyze. Or here at least both of you can sit in a same computer and work, but if you are in different places, you can just send it as an attachment in the olden days. Now, of course, you can use Dropbox or whatever. So, so that's the purpose of this version.
Yeah. All right. So for instance, I had already loaded it, so it's already there. In case I want to work on something else, which is this, I can select it. So you don't need to keep reloading it again and again. Once loaded, it will be there. Now, since I had created this, I'll just one more thing. When you go to versions and modules, if you are simultaneously working on the file, please select GTAP U with the main model. Otherwise, it might give error because I had created it by using GTAP U. This is the uncondensed version of GTAP model database. All right. So if you have loaded it for the first time, it is recommended that you run a test simulation after loading it. So when you run the test simulations, it is going to take a few seconds. There are no errors. So now it's ready to use. Before running our experiment of FTA between Vietnam and USA, I'll just show you a few more things through which you can also explore more and understand more. So in the view tab, there is a base data tab. From there, you can click on the core data. So for example, if I want to see bilateral exports, so VXWD, it's named as bilateral exports. I'm clicking on VXWD. Okay. Now, the commodities that I had selected, for example, textile, I told you I have not changed the sectoral aggregation, but if you can see the regional aggregation, it's Vietnam, USA, India, Canada, Mexico, rest of the world. Now, all trade commodities, if you want to see it for all the commodities, I'll keep it as it is for now. Let's say the first in between tab is for exporting country and the last tab is for the importing country. So when I click on, let's say, Vietnam, and let's say I click on all regions. So this will show me exports from Vietnam to all other countries, that is USA, India, Canada, and Mexico. If I specifically want to see exports from Vietnam to these countries or regions for textile and clothing, I can also specifically change that in the tab folder. Similarly, if I want to see exports of all regions to USA, so you can just play around with it. And if I just click this to all trade commodity, then you can see all imports of USA from all the regions that have been aggregated. You double click it, you will go back. So this is about the base data. So all the base data can be read from here. Next thing is within the base data, let's say tax rates, since we are going to work around the tariffs. So I'm going to show you just one thing here. So that is RTMS, which is ad valorem rate import taxes by source. Now, what does this show? Same thing, all traded commodities, you can select one or all, exporting region, last tab, importing region. So let's say I am trying to find out the taxes that are imposed by USA on textile and clothing on all regions. So 12.8% on Vietnam. Canada, Mexico, it already has an FTA under NAFTA, so no tax tariff barrier. And for India, it's 9.18%, and for rest of the world, 8.88%. So what we are going to do in our experiment is we are going to reduce this from 12.8% to zero, which means that Vietnam and USA are getting into an FTA with regards to textile and clothing sector.
Can you also show the other way around? Vietnam style?
Yeah. USA to all regions?
No, all regions to Vietnam.
All regions to Vietnam, yeah.
Just to see
Yeah.
Vietnam style.
Yeah. Yes. So Vietnam is imposing 9.3%, 5% on USA, 5.39% on India, Canada 12.4, Mexico 9.85. So now what will happen if Vietnam gets into an FTA with USA where it means 9.35 becomes zero? Yeah. So these are the base datas. And once we're going to run the experiment, these values will 9.35 will become zero. And we will look into that. But this is just for explanation. Again, if you double click this, you will go back. You can look into any other base data that you want to. Okay. This will run GTAP here. You can just this gives you a brief information about GTAP itself. Version here. Okay.
That is something right. You can go to code.
Yeah, I'll simply.
So this version is something that it's default content here, just a default content. But when you are creating a new version, you can always change the text.
So these are the closures. Exogenous closures means these are the variables on which you can apply a shock. Rest all are endogenous. And when
Yeah, just a brief explanation here is that in the model, interesting thing to note is that all the prices and all the volumes are endogenous, which means that every price is determined by the model and every quantity is determined by the model. The only exception is that you see QO endowment commodity. So that is basically the all the factor endowments. So we are assuming that all the factor endowments are fixed, but that is something one can change. So we call it an unemployment assumption. So we can make, currently we assume full employment. We can change it to unemployment if needed. Similarly, capital also we assume capital is fixed. We assume land is fixed. That may be realistic. We also assume that natural resources are fixed. That also may be realistic. So that is one thing. And the first few variables you see are all, first variable is population. So theoretically in this model you can also shock population and see what is the economic impact. But I wouldn't recommend doing that because that's not what it is meant for. But theoretically one can do that and see. Then you have a bunch of slack variables. The slack variables are basically saying that left hand side equals right hand side plus the slack variable. So supply equals demand plus slack variable. And when you say slack variables are exogenous, that means they are zero. You are not shocking them, which means supply equals demand. So that's the idea. And they are here to give you some very unique circumstances in which you can break the equilibrium. And so we are not. It's better not to touch them when you are starting to learn. Then there are many variables that start with the letter A. When they start with the letter A, they are some kind of technological change variable. So in the model, there are so many different technological change variables. So the technological change can happen at any level. It can happen, for example, you can produce more output, keeping all the inputs intact, or you can produce more output, keeping all the factors intact, but the intermediate inputs can change. And similarly, you can have more output, keeping all the factors the same, but keeping all the factors the same, but with no, keeping all the intermediate inputs the same, and more output, but the factors can change also. So there are a lot of these different variations. Similarly, there is something for trade also. You can your total trade may not change, but your trade with a particular country may change. So those kind of things. So all these things are captured here. And then all the variables that start with the letter T are tax variables. So those are the typical variables that we shock different tax policy experiments. Uh, and these are the main variables to think about. So of course for energy and environment, climate change and so on, we have a special version of the model in which we also have emissions. We also have emissions captured, CO2 emissions and carbon taxes and so on. And for if you are doing something on health, then some of the productivity variables can be used. So because of let's say for COVID, because of COVID, people passed away, deaths happen, disabilities happen. So you can take the productivity effect of that. You can say that labor productivity fell, and what is the impact of that. So there are many such things that can be done here.
Yeah. So since it's taking time to appear on the screen. I'm just going, if you want to read more about these variables, so you can go on the view tab. There is an option of sets and variables. You can click on that. All these variables, all the sets, all the coefficients have been, defined. So what does POP mean? What does AOL mean? Everything is there. And this help tab, along with that, you will have a help tab. You click on that help tab, and it gives you enormous amount of information. So I'm going to straight away come to the shock tab now. So what I'm reiterating, what we are trying to do here is that we are trying to create an FTA between USA and Vietnam with regards to textile and clothing. So when we go onto the shock tab, first we have to clear the shock list if it is there. Yeah, so we'll clear the shock list first. And then what is the variable that we need to shock? So the variable that we need to shock here is TMS. So this is source specific change in tax on imports of I, that is textile and clothing, from R into S region. So here I'm selecting the commodity, which is textile and clothing. Exporting country USA, importing country Vietnam. Now, what is the type of shock that I want to apply? It can be percentage change, it can be percentage change power, it can be percentage target rate. So obviously I know that it is 0%. So I'm going to select percentage target rate and I'm going to put the shock value as 0. And then I add it to the shock list. So this particular shock has been added. Now I want to do it for Vietnam as an exporting country and USA as an importing country for textile and clothing. So I change it to Vietnam as an exporting country and USA as an importing country. Percentage target rate shock value is 0. And again, I add this to the shock list. Okay. So when these are added, I go onto the solve tab. I change the solution method to GRAG since it's a 3-step solution method. Keep the parameter file as default and I will save my experiment. I've already saved my experiment, so I'm not saving it again here. But if you're doing it for the first time, you can, without any gaps, you can name it and you can write a little description about it here in the numeraire shock tab. So once you've saved it, every time you open it, you can load it. So I have already saved it as UVFTA, that is USA Vietnam FTA, whatever you want to name it as, and this is the description that I gave. So this will appear like this only. So I'm selecting this and I click on OK. And then I click on the Solve tab.
And this is a very simple, basic example, and one can do much more complicated things also. Like here, we assume only the textile and apparel tariffs are removed, but one can also do, like for example, in our vertical, we have done a lot of work on different free trade agreements between India and other countries. So then we look at multiple sectors. We can shop with a single statement. So there are more powerful routines available in the model. But today, since we are just giving an initial demo, we are just showing the basic step-by-step process.
Right. So when you click on OK, it will give you a result sheet. You will automatically be diverted to the results tab when you click on OK. Yeah. So now here you can look into the variables, like for example, with this FTA, has GDP index seen any change? So I will go to QGDP. Right. So the first column is of our use, that is SIM column. So it says that GDP index 0, minus 0, minus 0, minus 0, minus 0. For Vietnam, it has increased to 0.48. This is up to 2 decimals. If you want to see it beyond 2 or 3, let's say I select 4 decimal points. This will show you the results up to 4 decimal points also. So if it was showing negligible result for India, in minus terms also it is going to reduce. The GDP index is coming out to be 0.0004 for India. So the thing is that with this FTA between USA and Vietnam, it is going to impact the GDP indexes of the other regions as well, because obviously they have interlinkages. So it can be viewed for all the regions that we had selected, given the nature of the study that we are trying to do.
Impact of other country exports to
Yeah, we can see that also. So all those variables are here. So once you start exploring the variables, you will get to know. Other thing is that you can export this in the Excel sheet. So you just copy it, click on the copy tab, and you just paste it on the Excel sheet. So this entire result sheet will be available to you, and you can open it and analyze it for later purposes. Just double click it and it'll take you back. So like you were talking about exports. Okay, I'll show you. So QXS is the variable which we will want to see here. So if you click QXS right now, it is not going to give you the result sheet. It is going to say that 3D matrix, it cannot open it. Why? Because here in this case, yeah, you have to change it from everything, let's say, to a particular region, that is Vietnam. Now it is going to give you the result. So QXS star Vietnam star. So this is export sales of commodity I, that is textile and clothing, from Vietnam to S. So be careful, don't select QXS star star Vietnam. We have to see QXS Vietnam and then star. So this will show exports, percentage change in exports. All these small lettered variables are percentage changes. They always represent percentage changes. So these are percentage changes of exports given these sectors, not only textile and clothing, but all other sectors to all other countries. So that's the beauty of this model. Like I told you, it is not only going to impact the exports of textile and clothing for Vietnam, it is for Vietnam also, it is going to have impact other sectors as well. And you can see it for, so obviously for Vietnam, it is increasing by 116%. Textile and clothing export is increasing, but then grain crop export is falling, right? So it is having a diversion impact, right? So again, how it is impacting the exports or the trade between Vietnam and India, that can also be seen because of this FTA. Canada, Vietnam, Mexico.
This is between India and Vietnam, or India and
This is showing exports only for Vietnam.
Yeah, exports of Vietnam to different countries.
To different countries.
So the story that is coming out of here is that Vietnam's exports to USA doubles almost 116%, more than doubles. Whereas Vietnam's exports to India, Canada, Mexico, rest of the world falls.
False. With regards to
Why is that happening? Because that is trade diversion. So since US has become a very attractive market for Vietnam, since they reduced tariffs a lot, so Vietnam is doubling the exports to US, and then accordingly it's reducing imports exports to other countries. Similarly, one more thing that is happening is Vietnam's exports of other commodities to US is also falling because we assume full employment. When you have full employment of land, labor, capital, natural resources, then all the labor capital is pulled by the textile apparel sector, so the other sectors suffer because they don't have enough resources. Now, if you had assumed full unemployment assumption, then this negative impact on other sectors may be smaller because there will be enough labor to move to other sectors and so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, this also allowed for changes if you're seeing, like in an FTA, not just textiles, but there is, say, in meat and,
Yeah, it's showing now.
at No. We are also assuming we're giving a double shock.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
Then
Yeah.
seeing the impact both ways.
So in the shock,
But, all the typical, the practical models when we do, like all the FTA agreements that we analyzed, we looked at all the sectors together, shocking all the sectors. Here we are just doing a very tractable, simple exercise so that you can immediately say, because when you shock all the sectors, then the results will be, you can interpret that, but in a short time you cannot interpret that. You need time to digest that. Here I could tell the story very simply. It's very pretty much like you said, trade diversion and resources diversion. Internationally, it's trade diversion. Within the country, it's resource diversion.
so I had, shall I just come to the result sheet? I had actually jotted down all these.
Yeah.
So I think I should show that only because
Sure.
it took a lot of time.
Yeah, that's better. That's,
Yeah.
There are like the multiple, like a group, a consortium, three countries together.
Yes,
Then
that also can be.
together we can interpret.
Yeah.
And also come to the right level of tariff,
Optimal time.
optimal tariffs that will impact like positively all the three countries.
Yes.
So if there is a potential agreement that is supposed to take place, let's say,
Yes.
so you can reduce it to zero. You can, you can take 3 or 4 levels of tariff reductions.
Yes.
You can do that also. So when I did my PhD, I had worked around TPP. TPP was under the ratification phase.
Yes.
After Trump, it was completely done away with. So under TPP, I had taken it for all the 11 countries. So I can run that experiment taking all 11 countries. Again, area was textiles only, but if there was potential agreement happening in, let's say, grain crops area, I could have added that also. And since I was analyzing the direction of global textile trade at that time, so because of TPP, how is it not only going to impact the TPP region, but with in-depth study and literature review, and I had seen all the Asian and European players, which are important players in TMC, how are they also going to get impacted? So that gives a lot of material for policy analysis. So that ways, this model is, I find it brilliant to work around with this model because right logic should go in. We cannot just run spurious experiments. It should have the right logic.
The assumptions are also fair in this.
So assumption with the static CGE model, it is a perfect competition, constant returns to scale. And with regards to international trade, they assume Armington elasticity.
And we can modify those assumptions. There are models that have been developed with modified assumptions. Maybe you can quickly finish this, then we have some questions we can go through.
All right. So these are just the, like I told you, we can export all the results on the Excel sheet. So this first sheet basically shows percentage change in global merchandise exports. So the variable is QXWCOM. So when I looked into it, this will show you how the global merchandise exports for all the sectors are changing. QO is percentage change in the industrial output of the particular sectors in these particular countries, that is Vietnam, USA, India, Canada, and Mexico. So like we can see for textiles, how will industrial production be impacted? But due to interlinkages, we can also see how will industrial production be impacted in other sectors pertaining to other economies also. QGDP we had already seen. So we need to sit around with these result sheets and we need to further, do a lot of mind boggling to analyze what is happening, why it is happening. With proper reasoning, we have to come out with our policy analysis and policy uh, recommendations. Again, QXS, like I told you, QXS, this is for Vietnam. So how is exports of, let's say, textile and clothing from Vietnam to India changing? We saw by 116%, but for other countries, it is reducing.
So one question I noticed, which you can answer now, is why is Vietnam to Vietnam 16.16%? What is the meaning of that?
Yeah.
Maybe you can explain that, or I can.
You can explain it. It's okay.
So basically, it's so the question, I think Bright had asked the question: why is Vietnam to Vietnam exports are changing by some percentage? So previously, when Dr. Isha showed the trade data, she was showing what is the exports of Vietnam to different countries. So if you see there, Vietnam to Vietnam was zero. So the percentage changes that you see here, these are spurious when the initial values are zero. When the initial values are zero, even if you have like a million percentage here, it's still going to be zero. The answer is still going to be zero. So you have to ignore that. So you only have to focus on a country to all other countries. But if you talk about rest of the world, that is meaningful because rest of the world has many countries. So the trade within the rest of the world is non-zero. So any number you see there is meaningful. But a country to country, there is no international trade. There is domestic trade, but that is captured separately. That is in a different variable. So that's why Vietnam to Vietnam is zero, and the 16.16% is 16.16% of zero, which is $0. So I hope I answered the question.
I will just show one more variable which I had taken up in the Excel sheet. This is QFE, which is percentage change in demand for factor endowments. So due to the FTA, if I see for Vietnam, so demand for labor within textile and clothing industry will increase by 36.86%. And demand for labor in other industries is going to fall. But in utility and construction industry, it's increasing. Transport and communication industry, it is increasing. So maybe it is creating more demand for labor or more employment in these two industries with some connect in textile and clothing sectors. That connection needs to be established. Similarly, how this demand for labor is being impacted in USA, in India, in other countries, other regions that we have taken, that also we can analyze. So that is pretty much it. You can look into more variables. There are pretty much more variables that you can look into. And again, given the objective of your study, you will look into the respective variables. So that's it. You can take the questions. Shall I
So,
screen sharing?
yeah, I think maybe you can keep this screen for some time if you want to. I think Bright has one more question. How do you do splitting into motor vehicle and parts? So that is actually uh, definitely possible. We do that from time to time. So, but it cannot be done in the standard framework. You cannot do it in the tools that we saw so far. There is a separate tool called Splitcom. Unfortunately, that's also freely available, so you can download it. And in that, you can split any GTAP sector into any combinations. Like the example you gave is motor vehicle and parts. That is definitely possible. In fact, we did a paper a while ago on splitting this motor vehicle parts into automobiles, motorcycles, auto parts, and motorcycle parts. So all kinds of things are possible. In fact, recently they've also developed like a six-digit level model. So you can have a six-digit level trade, HS6 trade data linked with the rest of the model, which is aggregated. So any sector you can go to six-digit level because all the trade negotiations happen at tariff line level. So at least at 60th level, it will be good to go. So that's the answer to that question. So there is a lot to learn here. So what we saw today is a very basic first introduction. So just to get everyone to a level where you can evolve from not knowing anything about CGE models to start doing some simulations. So this is more like a key to the room, and then you can explore it further. You can run it, and it's more like a learning by doing kind of model. So the more you run, the way we today did this. US Vietnam textile and clothing FTA exercise, you can try many other things. Many various other. For example, if somebody is interested in the sanctions on Russia, then then you can actually change the shock into the tariffs becoming prohibitive. So increase the tariffs say 100% or something, or you directly reduce the trade to zero or something. Or if you're interested in the increase of tariffs between US and China, that again you can do. You can, instead of the tariff reduction shock that we did today, you can increase it. Or if you want to do the industry 4.0, because of industry 4.0, the productivity is increased in productivities are going to increase in many sectors. There are a lot of studies estimating what is the extent of productivity increase in different sectors. Then you can input them to each sector and shock the model. Then you can see what is the impact on GDP. Even this experiment, I was quite it was quite interesting to see that just because of the tariff elimination between US and Vietnam, just for textiles and clothing, you see the global textiles and clothing exports increases by 1%, which is it's a huge number. And I think Vietnam's textile output increases by 35%, which is again a huge number. For US, it's despite the fact that Vietnam is opening up, US is actually reducing its exports. So these are all quite interesting because policymakers may find them quite interesting because you get to see this both the directional changes and also the magnitudes, and you can see the stories from different sectors. And one thing to remember is that to be really proficient in these models, one has to understand the theory in depth, and you have to explain through the theory of the model rather than coming up with logical explanations. You have to explain through the theory, like what is being assumed there. Like for example, the moment I saw that Vietnam's sectors are declining, all sectors except textile and clothing are declining. If I didn't know the theory, it will be puzzling because if from a logical point of view, you would think that if textiles increases, it's an important sector for Vietnam, then other sectors also should increase. But the moment I remember that we have assumed full employment, so when you assume full employment and if you don't have any productivity increases, then the only way this sector can benefit is by taking away resources from other sectors. Labor would be pulled away, capital would be pulled away, and so on. So that's why you see the other sectors falling. So these critical understanding of the modeling assumptions is very important, but it will come with practice. One does it over and over again and looks at literature. One thing we didn't show today because of lack of time, and also because of the slow navigation, is the model code itself. And those who are interested, you can directly see that when you go to the Ranji tab, and if you click on view, there is an option called results using analyze GE. So if you click on that, then it will open the model, and the model is quite well documented. You can see all the explanations. It's arranged in modules, so you can spend a lot of time learning that. And there is a GTAB book also that's freely available on the GTAB website. You can search it, so one can do a lot of learning from this. So I think with that, unless you have something to add,
That's I just wish everyone all the best and thank you so much for the opportunity. That's it. It was a good experience. Thank you.
yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Isha, for coming here, and I hope everyone benefited from this. So any more questions from the audience? Yeah, please go.
I have two, three related technical things related.
Sure.
In the shock variable in CGE model for changes in TFP, for changes in climate change, or any multiple sites, there the intercept in the production function, that's where the shock is included. Then how this will differentiate whether it is happening because of technology or happening because of climate change or other variables? That was one question. And if you want to introduce the supply shock like we are experiencing in case of the sunflower oil after this war, which will be the right parameter in the equation system where we can impose some sort of shock? These two are my queries.
Yeah, these are great questions. Second one is easier to answer. So second one, we use the intercept basically. So once you say that the it's I told you earlier about this uh, increasing increasing output for the same level of inputs. That is a productivity variable. So that productivity variable is like you also said, it's like the intercept in the production function. So that variable can also be taken as a swap variable. So what you can do is, for example, if you want to say that the supply of wheat has gone down in, let's say, Ukraine or Russia, whichever country, then you can actually go to the model and you can make output for wheat in Russia or wheat in Ukraine exogenous, because by default it is endogenous. Make it exogenous. In order to make it exogenous, you have to make some other variable endogenous, and that is the productivity variable. So you can make this productivity variable endogenous. So whatever happens to productivity, to make sure that the production goes to zero, the supply goes to zero in that country, then you can trace the impact on other countries. So that is kind of a simple answer to your question. But of course, a lot of considerations should be put in there. If which basically we basically assume that you know how much the production is going to go down, right? So or we have to make some assumption there. Like typically we make an assumption that okay, if we shut down all production in Russia and Ukraine of wheat, what will happen to the rest of the world? So that is kind of an extreme approach, or you can also go midway, half, 50% or something. So you can have multiple scenarios. That is for your second question. On the first question on climate change, yes, absolutely. Being this is an economic model, so there are two ways in which you can do climate change related modeling. One is how does the economy cause climate change, and that part is like emissions, like how much emissions are being caused by the economic activities. That is captured through the emission factors. So when you even for this shock, if you're using the GTAP E model, which is a model that has emissions, you will be able to see the impact of this tariff reduction on emissions, CO2 emissions or non-CO2 emissions or even air pollutants and so on. Then, so that is the if you're interested in understanding the impact of the economic activity or economic policy on emissions, that could be one thing. But your question about what is the impact of climate change on the economy, there again you have to take the climate change models from outside, like from you have to take the results from the climate change models. And for example, if you take agricultural sector, they would say that the yield increases or decreases because of warming. Sometimes yields can also increase in some crops, but in most cases the yield will effectively fall because of various damages that are caused, submergence and so on. So now what happens is then you take the productivity in agriculture as a proxy for yield, because effectively that's what it is. With the same level of land, you can produce more output. You also have such a productivity variable. Now, instead of saying all inputs, you can say land related productivity. So for the same extent of land, you can produce more output or less output. So that will dictate the yield impact, yield shock that you can introduce into the model. So, and then you can shock the model. So we have done a lot of work in the past on this climate change effect on the economy. So typically this is what we will do. We'll get a climate change model which will tell us the changes in yields, and then we'll plug that into the GTAP model. So what will happen if yields fall or increase so much on the economy by sector? By sector you can see that. So these are some broad ways. There are also other things like you can also think about renewables, substitution between fossil fuels and renewables. If you're talking about the climate change mitigation policies, that is also possible. You can you have a special version of the GTAP model called GTAP Power Model, in which you have all the renewable sectors also captured. So you see the substitution between. So if you want to have a particular emissions reduction target, let's say Paris Agreement or COP26, net zero commitments. So if you have all these commitments, you can impose to the model. You can tell the model that I want to impose the emission reduction by this much, and then the model will tell you what should be the mix of economic activities to reach there. And typically the mix will say that you are going to reduce your fossil fuels, you are going to increase your renewables, and you are going to reduce your other energy intensive sectors and increase your less energy intensive sectors and so on. So these are all some examples of how you can do the combination of energy, environment, climate change, feedback effect with the economy and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Badri. Shall I take just one more question?
Yeah.
Here, all the results what we are seeing is based on our shock, but the base data is it may be 2014 or 2000, a little bit earlier. So when we are observing like employment is going to fall by 5% or 10%, this 5% is with respect to the base data, maybe 10 years earlier. So when we are writing any interpretation for the future, then how to make adjustment for it?
Yeah.
Whether it should start from the present or the reference will be only with respect to the base data here.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there are a few things to understand here. One is you're absolutely right. In this example, we're using 2014 data. and the results are based on that. Now, if when you're doing real-time simulations like the policy simulations we are doing right now in the government, we typically update the data, and there is a procedure for that. There is something called GTAP adjust, and you can go there and you can input the current macroeconomic totals, for example, GDP and its components. Then all the variables will be scaled up. So essentially, you're assuming the same structure of the economy, but the values will be today's values. That is one assumption you can make, or you can also change the structure. If you have a lot of you have some time and resources to put in, then there are ways to, in the zeta budgets, there are ways to even adjust the sectoral trade output and so on to the current levels. So you have the ability to adjust the data. That is the first thing. Secondly, for an academic study and for purposes of bigger picture understanding, high level understanding, with a clear appreciation that these numbers are not to be taken very seriously. So these numbers are only for guidance. From that point of view, these are still helpful because in my experience and like many other researchers' experience, when we update the data like the way I suggested, it is quite likely that here you see 116%. After doing a lot of effort to update the data, you may get probably 117% or 114%. So it actually doesn't make a huge difference. So if you are constrained in terms of time, then you can just use the whatever is the latest publicly available data without any updates. You can add that as a caveat in your study. Particularly in academic studies, people don't have any issue with using relatively older data. And even in policy, we can use that and we can add that as a caveat that, given the time frame that we had, we could not update the data. So we're using that, but it will not affect the results by so much. And there is literature to show that, and we can focus more on the insights we gather from it. But today's exercise, I will focus more on the insights gathered from it. What are the insights? One is this is going to lead to trade diversion. This is also going to lead to resource diversion within Vietnam. US is going to lose. Vietnam is going to gain in the sector, and so on. So these are all some qualitative inputs you get from this, which are also actionable. Based on this, the US response for this would be, okay, why am I doing this deal if I'm going to lose? Why don't I ask the Vietnamese to give access to some other sector? So they can negotiate in that way. So you get a lot of actionable insights from this exercise. So from that point of view, you don't have to actually update the data. You can go with the caveat that the data is relatively old, but the economic structure in the past 5-6 years is largely similar. It hasn't changed so much, and you can use these percentage changes to say that this is the likely impact of this thing. So these are some explanations for that. So the short answer is that yes, you can update if you want. There are ways to update it, but you are not going to gain a lot by updating it. The extent of time you are going to put in for updating may not be really worth the effort, particularly if you are just interested in getting some insights out of it. So I hope I answered it.
Thank you, Dr.
Any other questions? Okay, so thank you very much again, Dr. Isha, and all the participants for staying online, and I wish you all the best. And you can always stay in touch with Dr. Isha and also our team if there are any questions. And it will be best if you can directly contact the GTAP Center at Purdue. They'll be able to answer most of the questions. But we are also here to help. But we would like to see more studies coming from all the both within NITI Aayog from our colleagues and also with the other organizations, think tanks, companies who are all part of this. We hope that this is going to trigger some interest and some studies in using this kind of models. So thank you once again. With this, we end this session. Thank you.
So